Alright, what's going on everyone, and welcome to the series in which I introduce you to all of the most powerful competitive decks in the modern format. The goal here isn't to give exact deck lists as those change constantly, but rather just to give a brief overview of how the deck works so you can be prepared if you're new to the format. So today we're looking at the deck that this channel is named after, Affinity. The deck plays, look, it plays some of the worst cards in Modern, but it's a synergy deck. They add up to a very powerful deck. So let's start with Frogmite, Mirror Enforcer, and Sojourner's Companion. I think this illustrates my point. We have a 4 mana 2/2, we have 2 7 mana 4/4s. These are terrible, not good cards, except for one important aspect, and that is the affinity keyword. These have affinity for artifacts, meaning that their cost is reduced by the number of artifacts we control. And what makes this so powerful is we have artifact lands. Darksteel Citadel, Treasure Vault, these effectively count for double when casting something with affinity, because not only do they tap for mana, but they also reduce the cost. There's also a ton of dual lands with the artifact type. Now technically these enter tapped, however, because they reduce affinity cards by 1 anyway, that sort of counts as 1 mana even if it's tapped, and the following turn it effectively produces 2 for those affinity cards. So these affinity creatures, even though their cost is really high, our lands kind of count for 2 every time we cast them. But what really turbocharges this deck is the combination of Ornithopter, Memnite, and Springleaf Drum. Once again, at first glance, these seem not very good, right? A couple 0 mana creatures that, they're not very powerful, and a mana rock, a 1 mana tap it, tap a creature to add a mana of any color. This seems all just not very good, but this is how this plays out. So like, say turn 1 with affinity, you can play like an artifact land, a 0 mana creature, and a drum with your land. That gives you 3 artifacts, and you can tap the drum and the creature for an extra mana. Even though it doesn't have haste, it can be tapped by another permanent, right? Like the drum, which can allow you to cast the Frogmite on turn 1. So right there on turn 1, you can have 4 artifacts. 4 artifacts just right off the bat. If you went first, your opponent hasn't even taken a turn yet. And it's very easy the following turn to get a Mirror Enforcer, because 1 more artifact land means you have 5 artifacts. It costs 2, so even if it's a tapped artifact land, you can tap your land and your Springleaf Drum, have a 4/4 on turn 2. At that point, it's turn 2, your opponent might not have even played anything but a land, and you've got at least 6 power, maybe 7, and 6 artifacts on the battlefield, right? And that's what Affinity does. Affinity basically looks at its opening hand, then reveals it to the opponent by playing the entire thing in a turn or 2. It literally just dumps its hand onto the battlefield and calls it a day. Now this might sound dangerous because dumping your hand that fast is scary if the opponent's playing removal, and you would be right, but this deck plays Thoughtcast and Thought
Monitor.
So once again, both of these have affinity, so we typically pay 1 blue mana for these, maybe 2 at the most, and they each draw 2 cards. The first is a spell that just draws 2, the second is a 2/2 flyer that draws 2. Not only is this great card draw, but sometimes we can just chain these together, like we can play a Thoughtcast, draw 2, find a Thought
Monitor.
Play that, draw 2 more, and you can just draw, and the cards that you're drawing are often free. Like if you play a Thought
Monitor
for 1 and draw 2 Mirror Enforcers, you can just spam those onto the battlefield for free, right? So a 1 mana 2/2 flyer can put out 10 power if you hit 2 4/4s. And that's what Affinity really does. It like machine guns its hand onto the battlefield just super quick. Just, artifact. Here's more artifacts. They're free. I'm going to draw more artifacts, and it just churns through artifacts super quick. So with all these artifacts that Affinity produces, it would be silly not to play things like Cranial Plating, Nettle Cyst. Both of these are pretty crazy. They pump a creature based on how many artifacts we have, so Plating adds power, Nettle Cyst gives +1/+1, it also makes a germ token, so it's a creature when we play it. These can make huge amounts of power, especially, remember, our lands are artifacts, so if we have 4 lands, Nettle Cyst at a bare minimum is a 3 mana 4/4, right? And that's not counting our 7 or 8 other artifacts that we might have. So these are very powerful, and also remember that we are playing flying creatures. We have Ornithopter and Thought
Monitor.
Ornithopter, it looks like a piece of crap, right? It's just filler to accelerate our mana with Springleaf Drum. It ups our artifact count, and it's a mana with Springleaf Drum, but it can also wear a cranial plating or a nettle cyst and become a devastating, very scary threat. And then there's Urza Saga. So we talk about this card a lot. It's played everywhere in Modern, but it sings in Affinity because the tokens it makes are much more relevant. So if you're not familiar with this, it's a saga, it adds mana, and then it gets the ability to produce tokens, and then it sacrifices itself to find a 1-drop artifact. The creature token is a construct with power toughness equal to our artifact count. Technically, it's a 0/0 that gets +1/+1 for each artifact. And remember that you can get 2 of those because on turn 2, when it hits stage 2, you can activate it. But also on stage 3, when it's getting ready to sacrifice, you can activate it before it dies to get 2 of those construct tokens. And in most decks, a lot of decks are playing this, and these construct tokens are like, 3 3s or 4 4s, maybe they're 5 5s. But in this deck, they're like 10 10s or better typically. They're massive giant threats. We can get 2 of them, and we're getting those with our lands. The fact that our land makes these giant, huge construct tokens amazing. Also, when Urza Saga dies, we can go get a Shadow Spear to give one of them trample and lifelink, so that's pretty good. So yeah, you look at cards like Ornithopter, Memnite, Frogmite, and you see a lot of weak creatures, but it adds up to a lot of power. That's the idea behind this deck. It's a synergy deck that really relies on just having lots of artifacts. So we play a lot of kind of terrible artifacts, but we play them fast and free. That's the idea. So there is a lot of variation with this deck. So some of the other things you'll see, like first off, you'll see some old Affinity holdovers like Vault Scourge, Signal Pest, Master of Ethereum. These were in the tier 1 Affinity deck before Modern Horizons. The short story is there was an old Affinity deck that when Modern Horizons was released, Mox Opal got banned and that deck died. And then when Modern Horizons 2 came out, we got all this new stuff that reinvigorated the deck. So these are some old Affinity cards that typically aren't played, though some people do still play these. I mean, go to my channel page. I have Vault Scourge and Arcbound Ravager as my channel banner. Those cards aren't played anymore, but some of us still like them. Some of us still play them just because we're sentimental. I don't know. I like Vault Scourge personally. It's fun to put a cranial plating on it. I'm sorry. So anyway, there's also some value cards that people play, like Esper Sentinel and Genius Smith Emery. Esper Sentinel is a tax card. Basically, the opponent has to pay extra mana for their non-creature spells, and if they don't, you get to draw a card. And that tax is based on the power of the Sentinel, so if it gets pumped or if it's wearing a piece of equipment, that tax gets more and more difficult to pay. And Genius Smith lets you dig for artifacts when you play it, and then will get +1/+1 counters when you play artifacts, though that last ability only triggers once per turn, sadly. And then Emery, when you play it, it mills the top 4 cards of your library, and then you can tap it to cast artifacts from your graveyard. Of course, you don't have to hit the cards you're going to cast with the mill. It just can cast anything from your graveyard for the rest of the game. And remember, many of those cards will be free because they'll have Affinity. Recasting Thought Monitors and whatnot from the graveyard, pretty good. You also see Urza in this deck a lot, so it's 4 mana and it makes another one of those construct tokens like Urza Saga, and then it can aid in making mana, and it can also allow us to cast spells off the top of our library if we have a ton of extra land sitting around, or we just use its own ability to make mana to cast stuff. So that's the idea there. Also, fun fact, this card is why Mox Opal got banned, which is what killed the original Affinity deck, and now the new Affinity deck is playing the card that killed the original, so that's fun. The deck will also frequently play a variety of 1-drops, and these are played because they can be tutored up with Urza Saga. These change drastically from deck to deck. I could probably list 10 or 15 cards that you'll see in decks. Basically, if you're looking at an Affinity deck and you see like a single copy of a 1-drop artifact, chances are it's an Urza Saga target. That's the point. And also, although rarely, I guess it's worth noting because they are played occasionally, Galvanic Blast and Metallic Rebuke are played in more interactive decks. These are just burn and counter spells. They just get more powerful if we control artifacts, so worth noting there. and that is Modern Affinity. That's sort of what this channel is named after. Technically, the reason this channel is named Affinity for MTG, if you're curious, is I was originally a budget channel. I considered myself a budget-focused channel, so the name Affinity was more a play on the reducing the cost of Magic. I reduce the cost of Magic, therefore I have affinity for Magic, whereas affinity for artifacts reduces the cost of things based on artifacts. That's why, in case you want some background as to why this channel is named that, that's why. But anyway, be sure to check the description of this video to find links to metagame tracking websites for the most up-to-date deck lists. And if you like this video, I will also leave a link to a playlist filled with videos just like this one. I am slowly covering all the modern decks, so you can find that there as well. But in the meantime, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.